The moonlight filtered softly through the thin curtains, casting faint shadows across the room. Everything was still, yet beneath the surface, a storm of uneasy thoughts churned within Clara's mind. She had always been a light sleeper, prone to waking at the slightest shift in the air. But tonight was different. Tonight, something felt wrong. Clara lay in bed, her head heavy with the remnants of sleep, her thoughts clouded by a sensation she couldn't quite place. A sense of disconnection, as if the world around her was not entirely hers. Her limbs felt strange, almost foreign, as though they belonged to someone else. The familiar hum of the house, the ticking of the clock, the creak of the floorboards, all seemed distant, distorted. Her heart pounded as she sat up abruptly, the weight of a nameless dread settling over her chest. Something was happening to her, something that she couldn't explain. It had started weeks ago. At first, it was just an occasional wandering in the middle of the night, strange, disconnected moments where she would wake up in odd places, like the kitchen or the hallway. But soon it escalated. Her movements grew more erratic, her actions more puzzling. And worse, she had begun to do things she didn't remember. At first, Clara thought it was simply stress. Her job as a graphic designer had been demanding, and the pressure of deadlines had kept her up late most nights. But the phenomenon didn't stop. It only worsened. She began waking up with bruises, scratches, and a feeling of being watched. There were days when she could barely recall what had happened the night before. But the worst part was that, during the moments when she felt most awake, she could swear there was something else inside her. A presence, cold and detached, pushing her onward. Tonight, the feeling had intensified. Clara's mind wandered back to the most recent incident. She had woken up on the living room couch, surrounded by half-finished drawings and a thick layer of papers scattered across the floor. The eerie part wasn't just the disarray, it was the journal. It had been lying there, open to a page she didn't recognize, the ink smudged and uneven as if written in a hurry. But the thing that unnerved her the most was the entry that followed her name. Clara, the walls are closing in, and I can't remember how I got here. She had read those words over and over again, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of them. But nothing about it felt like her writing. It wasn't the way she thought. It wasn't her voice. And it certainly wasn't a memory she could recall. In the moments when she tried to reach out for answers, her thoughts tangled into confusion. She had gone to a doctor who assured her that sleepwalking was a common condition. But this wasn't just sleepwalking. Something deeper, darker was at play. Now, as the moonlight bathed the room in a cold glow, Clara felt a strange pull. Something inside her whispered that she needed to find out the truth, that whatever it was that had taken hold of her was waiting for her, just beyond the edge of sleep. The rustle of paper echoed softly from the kitchen. Her breath caught in her throat. The journal? She had left it in the living room, hadn't she? Without thinking, she stood up, her feet cold against the wooden floor. Her body moved as if guided by instinct, each step leading her toward the source of the sound. The kitchen door creaked open, and Clara stepped inside. The room was empty. The only movement came from the shadows cast by the swinging light fixture above. But there, lying on the counter, was the journal. Open once more. This time, the page was different. The handwriting was more frantic, more desperate. I can feel it watching me. Clara froze, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The words seemed to reach out to her, begging for a response, demanding something from her. She stared at them, her eyes wide with fear, unable to look away. The urge to run, to flee from whatever had taken hold of her, was overwhelming. But instead, she reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the page. As if by some unknown force, the pen seemed to fall into her grip, and her hand began to move on its own, writing words she didn't recognize. I see it too. The room seemed to shift, the walls narrowing, the air thick with the weight of an unseen presence. Clara's breathing grew shallow, her eyes darting around the kitchen. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing down on her chest like a heavy weight. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sensation vanished. Clara's hands stilled, the pen falling from her fingers as she stepped back, the cold sweat soaking through her clothes. Her pulse raced, her mind reeling from the encounter. What was happening to her? Was she truly sleepwalking? Or was there something darker, something more sinister at work? She turned and stumbled back toward the hallway, her heart pounding in her ears. Every step felt heavy, like the ground beneath her feet was shifting, pulling her deeper into a world she couldn't understand. The journal sat quietly on the counter, its pages filled with secrets that Clara wasn't sure she was ready to uncover. But one thing was certain: whatever had begun, it was only the beginning, and she was about to find out just how far it would take her. The sun was barely peeking through the blinds when Clara awoke the next morning, her body aching as though she'd been through a battle she couldn't remember. She sat up in bed, disoriented, the events of the night before clouded in a haze. The journal, the pen, the unsettling feeling of being watched. She could still feel the echo of it all, like the remnants of a dream that clung too tightly to reality. She glanced at the clock. It was already late, but there was no rush to get up, no pressing meetings or deadlines to meet. Her job, while demanding, allowed her the freedom to set her own schedule. Still, the sense of dread that hung over her made it hard to focus on anything else. With a sigh, Clara swung her legs off the bed, feeling the coolness of the floor beneath her feet. She could hear the distant hum of the coffee machine in the kitchen, the steady pulse of normalcy in a day that had already begun to feel anything but. As she walked down the hallway, her gaze flickered toward the living room. The journal. She had left it there, hadn't she? The living room was exactly as she had left it the night before. Papers scattered across the floor, her drawings abandoned in the corner, and the journal sitting quietly on the coffee table. But something was different. The book was open. Clara's stomach tightened. She hadn't opened it this morning, hadn't even touched it. And yet, the journal lay there, its pages turned as if waiting for her. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering above the edges of the paper, before she slowly approached it. The handwriting was still unfamiliar, but the words felt more urgent now. Clara, it's happening again. It's getting worse. Please remember what you've done. She inhaled sharply, her fingers curling into a fist as the words burned into her mind. A sickening feeling twisted in her stomach. What was she doing? Why was she writing this? The panic she had suppressed earlier bubbled to the surface, and she staggered back, knocking over a chair in her haste. Her hands shook uncontrollably, her chest tightening as she fought to breathe. She could feel her pulse in her ears, the blood rushing, louder than ever. Her thoughts were fragmented, disjointed. She didn't know where this was coming from, and she didn't know how to stop it. But one thing was clear: something was wrong. Something was happening to her, and she didn't know how to fight it. As her mind raced, trying to make sense of the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks, Clara realized that this wasn't just sleepwalking. This was something far more insidious. The journal, the strange entries, the feeling of being watched. It all pointed to something darker than she could have ever imagined. A knock at the door snapped her from her thoughts. Clara's head jerked up in surprise. She wasn't expecting anyone. Who could it be? With tentative steps, she made her way to the door, her fingers lingering on the handle before pulling it open. Standing on the doorstep was her neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, an older woman who lived a few houses down. Her silver hair was neatly pinned up, and she wore a concerned expression on her face. "Clara, dear," Mrs. Ellison said softly, her voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "I think we need to talk." Clara blinked in confusion, unsure of what to make of the situation. "What's wrong, Mrs. Ellison?" she asked, her voice shaky. The older woman hesitated, her eyes flickering past Clara and into the house. I noticed something strange last night," she said, lowering her voice as though not wanting anyone else to hear. "I'm not sure how to say this, but I think you might be in danger." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" she asked, a mix of curiosity and fear creeping into her words. Mrs. Ellison sighed, glancing over her shoulder as if checking to make sure no one was watching. "I saw you last night, Clara. I saw you out there in your yard walking around, but you weren't yourself. You weren't conscious. You were doing things. Clara's stomach twisted in knots. What do you mean? I saw you standing at the edge of the yard, Mrs. Ellison continued, her voice barely above a whisper. You were staring at the trees, and then you started to write. You were scribbling something in the air, as though someone was guiding your hand. I didn't know what to make of it. But now, after what I've seen, I'm afraid something is happening to you. Clara's mind reeled. She had no memory of what Mrs. Ellison described. No memory of being outside, no memory of writing in the air. Could it be another instance of sleepwalking? Or was there something more to this? I don't remember any of that, Clara said, her voice barely audible. I know, dear, Mrs. Ellison replied gently. That's what scares me. I've heard things. People have been saying strange things about your family, about your house. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. What things? What are you talking about? Mrs. Ellison looked around once more before speaking in a hushed tone. They say there's a curse on this place, that it's been passed down through the generations, and that it's starting to affect you. I don't know if it's true, but you need to be careful. There are things in this world that we don't understand. Clara's breath caught in her throat. A curse? Was that what was happening to her? Was this connected to the journal? To the strange happenings? It all seemed impossible. But at that moment, Clara couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. Please, Mrs. Ellison said, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. You have to be careful. You don't know what you're dealing with. Clara stood there, frozen, as her neighbor's words echoed in her mind. Something dark, something ancient, was lurking just beyond her understanding. Clara couldn't shake Mrs. Ellison's words. A curse? The thought felt absurd, something out of a Gothic novel, but there was an undeniable weight to it that gnawed at her, pulling her deeper into a spiral of unease. The more she thought about it, the more everything began to align. Her strange behavior, the journal, the inexplicable sensations of being watched. It all seemed to point toward something darker, something she couldn't yet grasp. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept wandering back to the unsettling conversation. Was she truly cursed? She had no memory of any family history that might explain this, no mention of anything out of the ordinary in her childhood. But maybe that was part of the curse. Maybe the truth was being obscured, buried beneath layers of time and memory. When evening fell, Clara found herself once again standing in the living room, staring at the journal. It lay open on the coffee table, inviting her with its dark secrets. Despite the fear curling in her chest, she knew she couldn't keep avoiding it. She had to know what was happening to her. She took a deep breath and sat down. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Her fingers brushed lightly over the pages, each one filled with scrawled entries that seemed foreign and yet disturbingly familiar. The words were a mixture of frantic pleas, cryptic statements, and bizarre descriptions of things Clara had no memory of doing. As she flipped through the pages, one entry caught her eye. I saw the shadow again. It's growing stronger, and it knows me. It speaks in whispers, urging me to do things I can't control. I don't know how much longer I can keep it at bay. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She had no memory of writing this. The shadow, the whispers, it sounded like something out of a nightmare. Yet the words felt like a call to something deep within her. Something she couldn't escape. But she couldn't stop herself from reading more. I tried to fight it, tried to stay awake, but it's impossible. It finds me in the dark, in the quiet, and pulls me into the blackness. Every time I wake, I'm further from myself. I don't know if I'll be able to hold on much longer. Clara's hands trembled as she held the page. The words seemed to crawl across the paper, seeping into her thoughts, leaving behind a chill that settled deep in her bones. She had written this. She had written it, and yet she couldn't remember any of it. How was that possible? What was she doing in the dead of night, and why couldn't she remember? Her mind was spinning, and with each turn of the page, the world around her seemed to tilt. A sharp noise broke the silence, like a thud from upstairs. Clara jumped, her heart racing, her head snapping toward the stairs. Was someone upstairs? Or was it just the house settling? The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the weight of the journal's revelations sank in. Something was watching her. Something had been guiding her actions, pulling her deeper into this twisted maze she couldn't escape. She pushed herself to her feet, the journal slipping from her fingers onto the floor. The sound had come from the attic. Clara knew she should go up there, investigate, but her body was frozen in place. Fear wrapped around her like a vice, and she felt the pull of something malevolent, something waiting for her just beyond the threshold of the attic door. The house was quiet again, but Clara could feel the change in the air. It was as though the atmosphere had thickened, becoming heavier, oppressive. She swallowed hard and moved toward the door, her footsteps hesitant but resolute. When she reached the stairs, she stopped, her hand resting on the wooden banister. The attic door was at the top of the landing, slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness peeked through the gap, inviting her into the unknown. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly made her way up the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. The house seemed to groan in protest, the walls whispering secrets she wasn't ready to hear. At the top of the stairs, she stood before the attic door. It was as if it was waiting for her, beckoning her to step inside. She could hear nothing now. No creaks, no whispers, just the steady beating of her own heart. With a trembling hand, Clara pushed the door open. The attic was cold, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. Boxes, old furniture, and forgotten trinkets were scattered around, each one covered in a thick layer of dust. It was a place that had long been untouched, a silent witness to years of neglect. But in the far corner of the room, something caught Clara's eye. A small wooden chest, old and weathered, sat atop a pile of forgotten belongings. The chest was locked, its surface marred by deep gouges, as though it had been opened and closed many times. Without thinking, Clara moved toward it. Her heart raced as she knelt in front of the chest, the feeling of something pulling her toward it becoming almost overwhelming. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold metal lock. It clicked open, almost as if it had been waiting for her to do so. Inside the chest, Clara found a collection of papers, old, yellowed pages filled with more of the same frantic handwriting. She pulled them out, each sheet seeming to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain. It's happening again. The shadow is closer than ever, and it's taking me. I don't know how much longer I can stay conscious. It's already begun, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. Clara's hand shook as she read the words, the panic in her chest rising with every line. The entries were becoming more and more desperate, and each one seemed to confirm the fear that had been building inside her for weeks. She looked around the attic, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting the shadow to materialize right in front of her. But there was nothing but the thick silence and the oppressive darkness that seemed to cling to every corner. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Clara saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, its outline shrouded in darkness, a presence that felt both familiar and terrifying. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step toward her. "Clara," the voice whispered. It was her own voice, but distorted, warped by something far darker. Clara's heart thudded painfully in her chest as the figure in the doorway stepped forward. The whisper of her own name echoed in the attic, but it wasn't her voice. It was something else, something distant and hollow, as though it were calling from the depths of her subconscious. She froze, unable to move or even breathe. The figure was tall, its shape impossibly thin, like a man stretched and distorted beyond human proportions. It seemed to shift in the darkness, its edges blurring, as though it were part of the shadows themselves. But its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark pits, empty and consuming, drawing her in, pulling her closer to the void. "Clara!" The voice came again, only this time it was colder, more demanding. "You've been looking for me." A chill ran down her spine. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound escaped her lips. Instead, her hand reached out, almost of its own accord, toward the figure. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but the compulsion was too strong. The journal, the chest, the attic. They all seemed to blur together in her mind, and in that moment, the only thing that felt real was the pull of the shadow before her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaky, barely a breath. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it seemed to bend, twisting as if stretching to meet her. Then, in a voice that was no longer hers but something darker, deeper, it replied, "Who am I?" It chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. "I am what you've been running from, Clara. The thing you've been hiding from in the dark." Suddenly, memories, images that weren't hers, flashed in her mind. A young girl, her face twisted in terror, running through a forest. The sound of twigs snapping underfoot. The feeling of something chasing her, something relentless and hungry. A voice calling her name, coaxing her deeper into the trees. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, and as Clara watched, she realized with a sickening lurch that the girl was her. Her but not her. Clara stumbled back, her legs weak, her mind reeling. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The figure before her shifted closer, its presence growing heavier, like a weight pressing down on her chest. "I've been inside you all along," the shadow rasped, its voice now a mix of Clara's own and something foreign, something ancient. "You invited me in the moment you opened that journal. And now, it's time to finish what we started." Clara shook her head, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the figure's words. She could feel its coldness seeping into her skin, a numbness spreading through her limbs, rooting her to the spot. "What do you want from me?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible, her throat dry with fear. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her question. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it reached out, its long, spindly fingers brushing Clara's cheek. "I want you to remember," it said softly. "I want you to see the truth you've been hiding from all these years." Suddenly, the attic around her seemed to shift. The walls warped, bending as though the very fabric of the house was unraveling. Shadows danced along the edges of her vision, and the air grew thick, suffocating. Clara stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the space seemed to close in around her. And then the memories came rushing back. She was no longer standing in the attic. Instead, she was back in the forest, running through the trees. The ground was wet beneath her feet, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. The darkness pressed in, swallowing everything in sight. She could hear the sound of something behind her, something close, its breath ragged and uneven, its presence a constant, suffocating weight on her shoulders. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she turned a corner, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The girl she had seen in her earlier vision was there, running alongside her, but now Clara could see her face more clearly. It was a mirror image of her own, a younger version of herself, filled with terror and confusion. The girl stumbled and fell, her hands hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Clara stopped, her heart leaping into her throat as she reached down to help her. But when she touched the girl, the world seemed to collapse around her. The forest melted away, and she was back in the attic, gasping for breath, her hands shaking. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight in the air. Clara looked down at the journal in her hands, now open to a new entry. "I tried to run, but it caught me. It always catches me. There's no escape from the shadow. It is me and I am it. We are one." Clara's mind reeled as the meaning of the words began to settle in. The shadow was not just something outside of her. It was part of her, a part of her that she had buried deep inside, something she had tried to forget, something she had never wanted to face. And now it was back. Her hand trembled as she reached for the next page, desperate for answers, desperate to understand what was happening to her. But as she read, her heart sank. "You've opened the door, Clara. There's no going back now. The shadow will consume you, piece by piece, until nothing is left." The finality of the words struck her like a physical blow. She felt the walls closing in, the darkness creeping around the edges of her vision. The journal, the attic, the figure. They were all part of the same nightmare, a cycle she couldn't escape. She was trapped, bound to the shadow, and there was no way out. She had tried to outrun it. She had tried to ignore it. But now Clara understood the truth. The shadow had always been inside her, and it would never let her go. Clara sat motionless in the dimly lit attic, the weight of the journal in her hands like a stone pressing down on her chest. The words she had just read echoed in her mind, looping over and over, each one sinking deeper into her soul. The shadow, it was her. She had become it. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the realization gnawed at her. There was no escaping it. The figure in the doorway had been a part of her, a manifestation of her darkest self, a presence she had ignored, buried, until now. And now there was no turning back. The attic seemed to grow colder, the air thick with the oppressive weight of her thoughts. Clara could feel the room closing in around her, the walls pressing inward as if the very house itself were alive, breathing in sync with her panic. She fought to steady herself, but her mind was a whirlwind, spinning faster with each passing second. She needed to understand. She needed to know what had happened to her, why this was happening. The memories were still fragmented, broken pieces of a puzzle she could barely comprehend, but there had to be something, some clue hidden in the past, that would explain it all. Clara's gaze fell to the floor, where the journal lay open, its pages still trembling with the energy of the words she had just read. She closed it slowly, her fingers lingering on the cover as if seeking comfort from the worn leather. There was something almost familiar about it, something that felt like it had been a part of her for longer than she could remember. She needed to go deeper. With a heavy heart, Clara stood, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The attic felt different now, no longer a place of forgotten memories and dust-covered treasures, but a space filled with shadows, each corner hiding secrets that she was not yet ready to face. She didn't want to go back to the journal, but she knew she had no choice. The moment her fingers brushed the pages, a surge of electricity shot through her body, as if the journal itself had come alive, responding to her touch. The words blurred, rearranging themselves before her eyes. Started when I was a child. I never knew who I was, not really. They told me I was just a normal girl, but I always felt different. There was something in me, something dark, something wrong. They never understood. Clara's heart skipped a beat. The journal had become a portal to her past, its pages unlocking memories she had buried deep. The words weren't just her thoughts. They were the whispers of her younger self, the parts of her life she had locked away in the deepest corners of her mind. I remember the first time it happened. I was 11. My parents had just moved us to the house on the hill. The house was old, with creaky floors and a coldness that seemed to seep into the bones. I hated it. I hated the feeling of being watched. But what scared me most was the attic. The memory flooded back like a tidal wave. Clara had been just a girl when they had moved into the house on the hill. It had been a grand old place, filled with history, but something about it had unsettled her from the start. The attic had always called to her, beckoning her with its dark promises. As a child, she had sneaked into it, eager to explore, despite her parents' warnings to stay away from the upper floors. It was there, in the attic, that she had found the first sign of the shadow. It had been a fleeting moment, a glimpse of something lurking in the corner, watching her. But it was enough to leave a scar on her young mind. And though the memory was faint, Clara now realized that the shadow had been with her even then, lurking in the corners of her childhood, shaping her into what she was now. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I went anyway, and that's when I saw it, the thing that would follow me my whole life. Clara closed her eyes, her breath hitching as the next memory surfaced. She was standing in the attic, the air thick with dust and the smell of mildew. A shape had moved in the darkness, a dark figure that seemed to shift and change as though it were made of shadows themselves. It had whispered her name in a voice that wasn't quite human. She had run, of course, but she could never escape it. No matter how far she ran, No matter how many years passed, the shadow always found her. I've tried to forget it, to bury it deep within me. But the shadow is part of me now, and it always will be. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the last of the journal's words etched themselves into her mind. The shadow wasn't just an external force. It was a part of her, a reflection of everything she had tried to suppress. The fear, the guilt, the dark thoughts she had always pushed away. It was all connected. Tears welled in her eyes as she finally understood the true nature of the curse she had inherited. It wasn't something placed on her by an external force. It was something she had always carried with her. Something that had been born inside her from the moment she first encountered that dark presence in the attic so many years ago. The shadow had never left her. It had been inside her all along. Clara's mind reeled, her thoughts crashing together in a chaotic storm. How could she have been so blind? How could she have lived her life, thinking she was just a normal woman, when the truth was so much darker? As the journal's final words continued to echo in her mind, Clara felt the weight of the shadow's presence once more. It was here, in the attic, in the room with her, and it was stronger than ever before. She could feel it pressing against her, pulling her into the depths of her own darkness. She couldn't run anymore. The shadow had already consumed her. Clara's fingers trembled as she closed the journal, its dark presence lingering like a weight on her chest. The truth had been revealed, but it was not the kind of truth that offered freedom. Instead, it had shackled her even tighter to the very thing she had been trying to escape for years. The shadow, the dark presence that had stalked her throughout her life, was not an external force. It was a part of her, woven into the very fabric of her existence. Her breath caught as the air around her grew colder still, the attic pressing in as if the very walls were closing in. The shadow was close. She could feel it in her bones, crawling through her veins, its cold fingers wrapping around her mind. Clara's eyes darted to the floor, where the journal lay open. The final entry was not like the others, it was different, almost as if it had been written with a purpose, a last desperate plea from the version of herself that had once tried to escape. There was something she had missed earlier, something hidden in the text that now seemed too important to ignore. She leaned forward, her breath shaky as she read aloud. To free yourself, you must confront the shadow. You must release it, or it will consume you entirely. Only the ritual can break the bond. But be warned, the cost will be high. The shadow will try to stop you. It will fight with everything it has. And if you fail, Clara's heart skipped a beat. She already knew the consequences. There was no need to read further. The shadow would do everything it could to stop her from performing the ritual. It would fight her, drag her deeper into the darkness. But what other choice did she have? She had to try. She had to end this once and for all. With a deep, shaky breath, Clara rose to her feet, determination coursing through her despite the fear clawing at her mind. She didn't know the specifics of the ritual, but she could feel the pull of something ancient and powerful in her bones. The journal had given her the first step, the confrontation. The second part she could only guess. But one thing was certain. She had to go back to where it all started. The attic, the place where she had first felt the shadow's presence, the place that had haunted her for so long. Clara's steps were slow, deliberate, as she moved to the center of the attic. The space seemed to grow darker, the air thickening with each movement she made. The shadow was already there, waiting, watching, like a predator sensing its prey. Clara! The voice came again, low and chilling, but this time it was different. There was an edge of something almost familiar in the tone, as though it was trying to coax her into submission. "Let me go," Clara whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "You're a part of me, but you don't control me. I won't let you." The temperature dropped even further, and Clara could see her breath in the air, the chill seeping into her skin. She could feel the shadow moving around her, circling her like a vulture, waiting for her to make a mistake. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. The ritual. Clara closed her eyes, recalling the fragments of memory from the journal, the desperate plea for release. She didn't know the specifics, but the instinct to act was overwhelming. She began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, the words forming like a chant, a prayer. "I confront you now," she murmured. "I will not run anymore. I will face you, and I will free myself from your grip." As she spoke, the air in the attic seemed to vibrate, and the shadows around her began to twist, swirling like smoke in a storm. The temperature dropped even further, and Clara could feel the presence of the shadow growing stronger, its grip tightening around her heart. "Clara!" The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape me. I am you. You are nothing without me." Clara gritted her teeth, her hands trembling at her sides. She could feel the shadow pressing in, trying to smother her, to drown her in its darkness. But she would not give in. Not this time. "I am not you," Clara said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "I am me, and I will take back my life." The words reverberated in the attic, their power filling the room like a shockwave. The air shifted, and Clara could feel the weight of the shadow faltering, weakening. It screamed, an unearthly sound that made her stomach turn, but she did not flinch. She had faced her darkness, and she was not afraid anymore. The shadow lashed out, tendrils of darkness reaching for her, but Clara stood her ground. She took another step forward, then another, until she was standing in the center of the room, the shadows swirling around her like a storm. And then, something inside her shifted. The ritual, the release, it wasn't about fighting the shadow. It was about accepting it, acknowledging its presence, and then letting it go. She had spent so long running, so long fighting it, that she had forgotten the truth. The shadow was part of her. It had always been part of her. With a final, breathless exhale, Clara raised her hands and closed her eyes. She let go of the fear, the guilt, the shame. She opened herself to the truth of who she was, and in that moment, the shadow stopped. The darkness faded, dissipating like smoke in the wind. Clara stood in the center of the attic, breathing heavily, the room silent for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She could still feel the remnants of the shadow within her, but it was no longer suffocating, no longer a threat. It was a part of her, yes, but it no longer defined her. She had freed herself. With trembling hands, Clara picked up the journal one last time. The pages were now blank, empty, as if the words had been erased with the release of the shadow. The silence in the attic was profound, peaceful even, and Clara knew that her journey was far from over. But for the first time in her life, she felt free. The attic felt different now, still and silent, with an eerie tranquility that Clara hadn't thought possible. The weight that had once pressed down on her chest, the constant, suffocating presence of the shadow, was gone. She could still feel its traces, faint echoes lingering in the corners of her mind, but they were no longer overpowering. She had faced it, and she had won. But the victory wasn't what she had expected. It wasn't a sense of triumph or elation. It was something else, a quiet, lingering emptiness. The journey had been long, and the weight of the revelations had been heavy, but there was no sense of closure, no immediate relief. Clara lowered herself to the floor, her legs shaky as the adrenaline from the ritual slowly faded. The journal lay beside her, its pages blank, its once cryptic words now lost to her. She had read them all. She had absorbed them, let them guide her to this moment. But now that the shadow was gone, what was left? She closed her eyes, letting the silence wash over her. It was hard to put into words the way she felt, the absence of something she had been carrying for so long, a part of her that had been both a curse and a strange companion. The shadow had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember, and now it was simply gone. But that didn't mean everything was okay. Clara knew that. She wasn't naive enough to believe that the absence of the shadow would immediately make everything right. The journal had shown her a glimpse of her past, of the things she had done, things that had been buried deep, hidden from her own consciousness. Those things didn't disappear with the shadow. She could no longer ignore the lingering sense of guilt, the nagging feeling that something more had been left unfinished. The shadow had been a manifestation of something darker inside her. something she had tried to push away for years. But now that it was gone, what remained? The answer, Clara realized, was herself. But who was she now? Her hands trembled as she ran them over the journal's smooth, empty pages. It was strange, like the weight of the past had been erased, leaving her with a blank slate. But even a blank slate could be terrifying. The unknown stretched out before her, an endless expanse that she hadn't expected. Clara stood up, the journal still clutched in her hands. The air in the attic seemed lighter now, though the room still held a heavy history. There was no denying it. The house had seen things. She had seen things. And though the shadow was gone, its legacy would always linger. With a final glance around the attic, Clara made her way down the stairs, the sound of her footsteps the only noise in the otherwise quiet house. Each step felt different, as if she were walking on a new path, one she had never walked before. The old creaky floors no longer felt oppressive. The house no longer felt like a trap. She stepped into the hallway, where the dim light from the window cast long shadows across the floor. Her home had always felt like a place of confinement, a place where she couldn't escape her past. But now the air felt different, less suffocating. But that didn't mean she was free. Clara glanced at the hallway mirror, her reflection staring back at her. She had never truly looked at herself like this before. Now, the woman she saw in the mirror was unfamiliar, a stranger with the same face. She wasn't sure who she was anymore, or who she would become. But the uncertainty didn't feel like a burden. Felt like a beginning. Taking a deep breath, Clara walked toward the front door. It was time to leave the house, time to leave behind everything that had held her back. The past was a weight she could no longer carry, but it would always be there, somewhere in her, a part of who she had been. As she stepped outside into the fresh air, Clara felt the sun on her skin, the warmth that contrasted with the coldness she had left behind. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life, and that was enough for now. The world felt bigger, more expansive. She was free, but she was also uncertain. There was no map to guide her, no clear path ahead. But that was okay. She had faced the darkness, and now she would face the light. Clara took a final look at the house before turning away, the weight of the past no longer bearing down on her. She walked forward into the unknown, her footsteps steady but unsure, her heart open to whatever came next. Clara walked through the quiet streets, the hum of the world around her seeming almost distant as she processed everything that had happened. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, a stark reminder that the world kept moving forward, indifferent to the changes within her. Her mind buzzed with questions she had no answers to. What now? How did one begin to rebuild a life after everything had been torn apart? The shadow had been a part of her, a constant companion. But now it was gone, and there was a strange stillness within her, as if the very air had shifted, and she was left to navigate a world she had once known, but now felt unfamiliar. Clara had never given much thought to the future before. She had been too caught up in the darkness of her past, too preoccupied with the haunting shadow that had controlled her every move. Now, without it, the silence was both a relief and a threat. She felt untethered, floating in a sea of uncertainty. Her hands trembled slightly as she dug them deep into the pockets of her jacket. She glanced around, watching as the world continued on. People walking, cars driving by, life going on as if nothing had changed. But Clara had changed, and in a way that made everything else seem foreign, like a dream she no longer belonged to. As she walked, she realized how isolated she had become over the years. She had pulled away from friends, family, and anyone who might have seen the cracks in her facade. The shadow had been her secret, something that kept her apart, something she had hidden away from the world. But now that it was gone, what did she have left? She stopped at a small park, sitting on one of the benches. The sound of children laughing and playing echoed in the distance, but Clara felt detached from it all. It was as if the life she had known was slipping away, and she wasn't sure how to reconnect with it. Her gaze drifted to a couple walking hand in hand, their faces alight with the kind of joy Clara hadn't felt in years. It made her ache, the distance between them and her feeling impossible to bridge. She wondered if they, too, had faced something dark, something that had shaped their lives in ways they couldn't explain. Or maybe they hadn't. Maybe they were just ordinary people, living ordinary lives with no shadows chasing them. She didn't know if she could ever have something that simple, something that pure. Not after everything that had happened. But at that moment, Clara made a decision. She couldn't keep running from her past. She had to face it, confront the things she had done, and find a way to live with them. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. The rest of the world would continue on, and she would have to find a way to fit back into it, even if it meant starting over. But she couldn't do that if she stayed stuck in the past. She needed to find closure. She needed to understand what had happened, what had driven her to the point where she had lost control. With that thought, Clara stood up, her resolve solidifying. She had an idea of where she needed to go, where the answers might be. The house where it all started. The attic, the journal, the shadows. They had been the catalyst for everything, and it was time for her to return. She couldn't keep avoiding it. She couldn't keep pretending the answers didn't lie there, waiting for her. The journey back was longer than Clara had expected. The streets unfamiliar and winding as she walked with purpose. The sun had set by the time she reached the old house, its silhouette looming in the distance, as if it were waiting for her. The house didn't look any different, but Clara felt the weight of it pressing on her chest, the memories rushing back in waves. The house had been her prison, and though the shadow was gone, it still held a strange pull on her. She wasn't sure if it was the house itself or the memories she had left behind. She stood in front of the door, her hand hovering over the knob. A deep breath, then she turned it and stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with silence. The house seemed to exhale as she crossed the threshold, as if it, too, recognized her return. Clara didn't know what she was looking for. Perhaps some final piece to put everything together. Maybe she was hoping for some grand revelation, something that would make sense of it all. But deep down, she knew that the answers weren't going to be simple. The shadow, the journal, the ritual, they were all part of a story, a twisted narrative that had shaped her in ways she couldn't fully understand. But she had to try. She had to face it one last time. Clara made her way up to the attic, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. The familiar creaks of the floorboards were unsettling, but she pushed forward, not allowing herself to turn back. The door to the attic was still the same, its old wood worn from years of use. With a quiet sigh, Clara opened the door and stepped into the room. The attic was just as she remembered it, dimly lit by the soft glow of the moon through the small window. Dust filled the air, a thick haze that seemed to hover over everything. But there was no shadow now, no presence that lingered, waiting to strike. For the first time in years, Clara felt nothing. The emptiness in the attic mirrored the emptiness inside her. The space felt abandoned, devoid of the weight it had once carried. The journal lay exactly where she had left it, on the dusty floor, its pages now empty. Clara stared at it for a long time, her fingers brushing over the smooth cover. The answers weren't here. They never had been. The shadow, the journal, they were just pieces of the puzzle, fragments of her past that had shaped her, but not defined her. She didn't need the answers anymore. What mattered now was that she was free. She had broken the cycle, faced the darkness, and emerged from it. There was no more running, no more hiding. It was time to live. Clara took one last look at the journal, then turned away, leaving the attic behind. The door closed quietly, and with it, she closed the chapter on the past. The road ahead would not be easy, but Clara was ready to face it. She had faced the shadows, and now she would live in the light. Clara stood at the edge of the driveway, looking back at the house one final time. It loomed behind her, quiet and still, a monument to the struggle she had endured. It was a place that had once held her captive, but now it was just a house, a structure of brick and wood that no longer had power over her. She had freed herself from its grip, but she knew the battle wasn't over. The real work was yet to come. As she turned and walked down the familiar street, her mind wandered back to everything she had learned. The journals, the shadow, the rituals, they were all fragments of a larger, more complex story. It was a story she had tried to run from. But now, she couldn't help but wonder if she was ready to piece it all together. What had driven her to sleepwalk? What had caused her to commit such horrific acts in the dead of night, only to wake up with no memory of them? The answers were buried deep, but Clara was beginning to understand that facing the past wasn't about finding clear answers. It was about acceptance. Acceptance that some things, some parts of herself would always remain hidden. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. Clara pulled it out and saw a message from an unfamiliar number. "We need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. There was something unsettling about the message, a coldness to it that sent a chill down her spine. She recognized the number. It was the same one that had once called her years ago, in the middle of the night, when the shadow had been at its strongest. It was the number of someone who had once been close to her, someone she had tried to forget. Peter. Clara's stomach tightened as she read the message again, the weight of his name dragging her mind back to a time she had fought so hard to leave behind. She knew what it meant. Peter was the key. He had always been. But he was also a part of the darkness she had tried to escape. For a moment, Clara considered ignoring the message. She could block the number, delete it, and continue on with her life. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. Peter had been there when the shadow had first begun to creep into her life, when the sleepwalking had started. He had been there when everything had unraveled, and the things she had done in her sleep had become far too real to ignore. Clara hesitated, fingers hovering over the phone. There was no going back. If Peter was reaching out, it meant he had answers. Answers that could unlock the final pieces of her past. But those answers would come at a price. Clara had no doubt about that. With a deep breath, she replied, "Where?" The response came almost immediately. "Meet me at the old pier, 10 p.m. Clara stood frozen for a moment, the air around her suddenly thick with tension. The pier. It was a place from her past. A place she had avoided. A place where things had gone horribly wrong. But now she had no choice. She had to face it. Peter had the answers she needed. The rest of the evening dragged by in a blur. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each passing minute filled with a sense of dread and anticipation. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, something she wasn't prepared for. Yet she knew she had to go. She couldn't allow the past to remain buried forever. As the clock struck 10, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the old pier. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting an eerie glow on the decaying wood beneath her feet. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore filled the air, the rhythmic sound soothing yet unsettling at the same time. Peter was standing at the far end of the pier, silhouetted against the night sky. He looked the same, tall, with broad shoulders and a slightly disheveled appearance. His presence was as unnerving as it was familiar. Clara felt the old pull, the same sense of connection that had once bound them together, and with it, the same sense of danger. He turned as she approached, his expression unreadable. There was a coldness in his eyes, a darkness that matched the depth of the night surrounding them. "You came," Peter said, his voice steady but tinged with something else, something dangerous. Clara didn't answer right away. She studied him, trying to gauge his intentions. She had learned the hard way that trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered. She couldn't afford to be careless now. "Why are you here, Peter?" Clara asked, her voice tight with both curiosity and caution. Peter chuckled softly, the sound grating in her ears. "I'm here because you need to understand," he said, taking a step closer. "You've been running from the truth for too long, Clara, but it's time to face it." Her pulse quickened. "What truth?" He smirked, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "The truth about the shadow, about the sleepwalking, about everything you've forgotten." Clara took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. "You know what happened?" she whispered, almost afraid to hear the answer. Peter's smile faded, and his expression grew more serious. "I know exactly what happened. I was there when it all began. And I know why you've been tormented all these years." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Tell me," she said, her voice desperate now. "Please, tell me everything." Peter stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "It wasn't just a curse, Clara. It was something more. Something you did. You summoned the shadow." Clara's stomach lurched. She had always suspected it. There had always been a part of her that believed she was somehow responsible for the nightmare that had plagued her for years. But hearing Peter say it aloud felt like a blow to the chest. "You summoned it?" she repeated, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Peter nodded slowly. "And you've been paying the price ever since. The sleepwalking, the terrible things you did, you weren't in control. But the shadow made you do them. It fed on your fear, your guilt, your regret." Clara's mind was reeling. "How do you know all of this?" Peter's eyes darkened. "Because I was there when you did it. I was the one who helped you." Clara felt the ground beneath her feet shift, the world tilting as her thoughts spiraled out of control. "You helped me? Why? What did you want?" Peter's lips curled into a cold smile. "I wanted to make sure you'd never escape it. I wanted to make sure you never forgot." Clara's heart stopped. The truth was more horrifying than she could have imagined. The shadow, the sleepwalking, the journal, they had all been part of his plan. You've been controlling me?" she asked, the words almost a whisper. Peter's gaze was filled with an eerie satisfaction. "Not controlling, Clara. Guiding. I was always the one who made sure you didn't stray too far from your destiny." Clara's hands shook as the realization hit her. She hadn't been running from the shadow. She had been running from Peter all along. And now there was no escape. Clara's mind raced, every word Peter spoke sinking into her like a heavy weight. The shadow, the sleepwalking, the strange things she had done in the night. None of it had been random. Peter had orchestrated it all, pulling the strings from behind the scenes like a puppet master. He had been watching her, guiding her, manipulating her every step. Her chest tightened as the truth settled in, and for a moment, she felt the world shift beneath her feet. The pier, the moonlight, the sound of the crashing waves. They all blurred together as if the very fabric of reality was slipping away. "You're lying," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You have to be." Peter's smile twisted, dark and knowing. "Do you think you could have escaped it on your own? That you could have outrun what you started? It's far too late for that, Clara." The anger surged within her, a heat that burned through her veins. She took a step forward, the need to confront him, to destroy the lies almost overwhelming. "No," she said, more firmly this time. "I didn't start it. You did. You were the one who led me down this path." Peter's expression softened, almost mockingly. "You can't blame me for what's already been done. You made the choice, Clara. You always had a choice." "No," she repeated, her fists clenched at her sides. "I didn't. I had no choice when you—" Her voice faltered as the memories surged. Visions of the sleepwalking, the bloody journal, the dark figure. She struggled to find the words. "You manipulated me. You used me." Peter took another step toward her, his eyes gleaming with something she couldn't quite place. "And now here we are. The truth is out, but what will you do with it?" Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had never felt more alone, standing on the edge of the world with a man who had ruined her life, who had twisted everything she knew into something dark and incomprehensible. Yet, there was something else deep within her, a flicker of something stronger than fear or anger, a quiet determination that had been growing since the moment she had started to piece together the truth. "I won't let you control me anymore," she said, her voice steady now, a quiet defiance in the way she spoke. Peter's eyes narrowed, his smirk faltering. "And how do you plan to stop me?" Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out the small, weathered book, the journal. Its pages were filled with the evidence of her past, the dark rituals, the words that had haunted her. But this time, it wasn't just a record of her torment. It was a weapon. She had studied it, understood its power, and now she would use it against him. Peter's eyes flicked to the journal, then back to her, a hint of surprise in his gaze. "You think that book can save you?" You think it can undo what's been done? I'm not trying to undo it, Clara said, her voice hardening. I'm going to finish it. Peter laughed softly, the sound rich with scorn. You're so naive, Clara. You're too far gone. You'll never be able to escape it. The shadow will always have a hold on you. Clara took a step toward him, holding the journal tightly in her hands. The shadow doesn't control me. You do. For the first time, Peter's expression faltered, his eyes flickering with something like doubt. Clara didn't wait for him to recover. With a swift motion, she flipped open the journal to the last page, the one she had barely dared to read. It was a page filled with symbols, ancient and ominous, their meaning cryptic. But she had learned enough. Her heart pounded in her chest as she began to chant the words. Words she had barely understood before, words that had seemed like nonsense. But now, they felt like her lifeline. The thread that would cut through the web of lies Peter had spun around her. Peter stepped back, his eyes wide with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What are you doing?" he hissed. Clara's voice grew stronger, more forceful. The air around her crackled, thick with power. "I'm ending this, Peter." Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. The wind whipped around the pier, and the moonlight seemed to flicker and twist, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of her words. The shadow, the dark force that had haunted her for so long, surged forward, coiling around her like a living thing. Peter recoiled, his face contorted in fury and fear. "No, you can't." But it was too late. The shadow reached out, not to possess her, but to take him. The very force that had once controlled her now turned against its master. Peter's screams echoed in the night as the shadow wrapped around him, pulling him into the darkness. His form flickered, twisted, and then, with one final anguished cry, he was gone. Clara stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath. The air around her stilled, and the eerie tension that had once filled the pier seemed to dissipate. The shadow was gone, vanquished by her will, by her strength. For the first time in years, Clara felt a sense of peace wash over her. But there was something else, something lingering in the silence. The knowledge that the darkness had not been fully eradicated, that there would always be shadows, always be things hidden in the corners of her mind. She closed the journal and slipped it back into her pocket, taking one last look at the empty pier. The night was quiet now, the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. As Clara walked away, she didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she would ever fully understand what had happened, or if the darkness would ever truly leave her. But she knew one thing for certain. She was free, for now.